Now that we finally have the transmission on the bench, we can start taking it apart. Just to reiterate, this is a 2007 4L60E out of a Silverado set up for four-wheel drive. The 4L60E is based on the 700R4, which GM first debuted in 1982. It was briefly reclassified as a 4L60 before the 4L60E came out, which was electronically controlled. These transmissions were used in all sorts of GM cars, trucks, and vans up until 2013, and it wouldn't surprise me if I was told they were still used in some vehicles now. That is at least a 31-year run for these transmissions, and they went through many design changes in that time. So while the overall layout and many of the parts are the same or very similar, there are quite a few different configurations these came in. So I wouldn't expect to use these videos for an exact guide, but they should give you a pretty good idea of how it's put together. I would strongly recommend staying organized and keeping parts in Ziploc bags or storage containers or something to keep things in order. Labeling these things and sorting them in order of when they came out works best for me. With that intro out of the way, the first thing we'll do is remove the torque converter. There are no bolts or anything here. All you have to do is slide it straight forward and off of the input shaft. It works to either grab it by the sides or thread in some long bolts or studs and use those to give you a handle to help leverage it off. It's quite heavy and there's still fluid in there, so be careful. If there's any chance of you wanting to reuse that torque converter, you should install a torque converter cap or at least tape over the opening to keep debris from getting in there. With that put aside, we can pop out these inspection covers in the bell housing if you haven't already. Next, we'll remove the shift cable bracket. This model uses Torx bolts, and I had to use a pick to clean the dirt out of them before they could be removed. Having a variety of picks and O-ring pullers is pretty much vital to a transmission rebuild, and they will see a whole lot of use over the course of these videos. I'll try to list any of the specialty tools or parts I use. None of these are sponsors or anything, and I'm sure alternatives will be just fine. I'll just provide what I used and an approximate cost for reference. Due to dirt and rust, the socket was a bit of a tight fit, so a few taps with the hammer helps make sure they're engaged fully. Although it might also mean a little bit of extra effort to remove the bolt from the socket. With those two bolts removed, the bracket comes right off. Next, we can remove the gear select and neutral safety switch. There are two bolts holding the assembly to the case, and then we'll remove the nut holding the shift linkage lever to the shaft, and with a few taps, wiggle the lever off of the shaft. Then we need to slide the shift switch assembly off of the shaft. Due to the rust on this one, it was pretty stuck on there, and a lot of it is plastic, so you need to be careful with it. We'll use a wire brush to remove some of the rust buildup so that it'll slide over the shaft more easily, and then we'll get in behind it with a screwdriver and carefully pry the whole thing off. Despite all the prying, it came off intact and in one piece. Next, we'll remove the small plug closing off the pressure port on the side of the transmission, and we can pop out the dipstick tube seal. Then we'll go ahead and remove the two fittings for the trans cooler lines. Next up is the removable bell housing. On older models, the bell housing is part of the case, but on these models, it's a separate part that can be unbolted. It's not explicitly necessary to remove the bell housing, but it does have to come off in order to replace the outside oil pump seal. Most of these bell housings use Torx bolts like the one here. On later models, they switch to a type of bolt that requires a very specific socket. The bolts on this bell housing, while they kind of fit a T50 Torx, they aren't. They're a T50 Plus. You can see the difference in these two sockets. This first one is a standard T50. This second one is a T50 Plus. The blades are wider, and something like this is required to get a tight fit in these bolts. Since the bolts are pretty tight and a lot of the times end up getting stuck, you really want a socket that fits as well as possible. I actually got away with removing the old ones for the standard T50 and the impact gun, but jumping ahead, when I tried to torque them down and reinstall them like that, it wasn't going to happen. I tried a tip I had read online and cut down the front of a standard Torx socket to get to the wider section towards the bottom of the blades. While it seemed like a good fit, the taper at the back meant it kept trying to walk out of the bolts. Thanks to the internet, it's pretty affordable to get a Torx Plus socket, and while you probably won't use it for much else, it's worth having for this particular job. When trying to tighten down the bolts without it, I managed to strip one of them out. I ended up welding a hex bolt to the head of the Torx one to remove it and replace it with a clean one. Anyway, long story short, just get a Torx Plus socket, and we'll get back to taking the transmission apart. Now is about as good a time as any to check the main unit end play. This doesn't necessarily have to be checked right now, but it should be checked before the oil pump is removed. This end play spec is very important to get right and can give you a good idea of the clearances inside the unit and tell you that it's assembled, at least mostly, correctly. By gently clamping vice grips on the splines of the input shaft, push it back towards the case, zero the dial indicator, and then pull the shaft away from the case to get your reading. This transmission's end play is right about 30 thousandths. That's a little on the high side, but it seems like all of the clearances inside this particular transmission ended up that way. For more ideal clearances in a performance application, for instance, you would want to change the washer on the top of the input drum to tighten up that clearance. But for us, that clearance is fine, and we'll make sure it's about the same after reassembling everything. Next up, we will remove the 2-4 servo. We'll start by removing the snap ring that retains the servo cover. After loosening it up with a few taps from the hammer, we'll use a large flat blade screwdriver to carefully pry it out. We'll start at the slotted opening and then work our way around the cover. The servo is spring-loaded, but in most cases the O-ring on the servo cover will keep it from popping out. Now that it's been pried loose most of the way around, the snap ring can be removed by hand. Next up, we'll grab the servo cover with channel locks and pull it away from the case. When trying to remove a part like this, you'll always have better results with a bit of twisting and wiggling action than just brute pulling force. Once the cover has moved out a bit, enough that the O-ring is fully visible through this slot here, you'll want to use a screwdriver or a pick to grab onto the O-ring and pull it out of that slot. Once the O-ring has been pulled out a bit, there are two options here. One, simply cut through the O-ring and pull it out of the slot. Alternatively, pulling against the O-ring will shrink the outer diameter enough for the servo cover to be popped off. And with the cover removed, we can slide out the servo's components. We'll slide out the fourth apply piston, and then, by pulling on the spring retainer, we'll remove the rest of the servo assembly. Don't forget to remove the servo return spring if it stays in the case. We'll set all that aside and get ready to remove the transmission oil pan. But first, we'll try to make the smallest mess possible and drain out as much of the oil in there as we can. Anybody who's changed a filter on an automatic transmission knows there's always tons of fluid left inside, and they will drip pretty much forever. So even though we drained out a few quarts of fluid, there is still plenty in there. With the majority of the oil taken care of, we can finally turn the transmission onto its side and remove the oil pan. There are 16 oil pan bolts on these transmissions. It's worth noting that since these transmissions came in such a wide range of vehicles, there are several different factory oil pans. You'll need to make sure you know which one you have when buying a replacement oil filter or when ordering a transmission rebuild kit that includes one. Having noted that, let's take out these bolts and remove this oil pan. With the bolts removed, we can pull the pan and the pan gasket right off. Then we'll remove the oil filter simply by grabbing it and wiggling it out of the seal in the case. We'll remove the oil filter seal now, since the pump is still held in place by the transmission. We'll simply use a mallet and a flat blade screwdriver to deform the seal and then pull it out with needle nose pliers. Of course, we'll be using new seals, so we're not too worried about the condition, but it is a good idea to keep them around to compare the new parts to the old ones. Next, we'll unhook all the electrical connectors. We'll unplug the 3-2 solenoid, then the input speed sensor, the torque converter clutch solenoid, the pressure control solenoid, the 2-3 and 1-2 shift solenoids, and then the manifold pressure switch. Then we'll farther rotate the transmission so that the valve body is pointing up. We'll start to remove the transmission case connector from the case. You'll want to push in all of these plastic tabs on the outside and then carefully pry it or tap it through the case. We won't be able to completely remove it without removing the valve body or the pressure solenoid. In hindsight, it would have been simpler to just remove that now and get the whole wiring loom out of the way, but this worked out too. Next, we'll remove the shifter detent spring from the bottom of the valve body. There is only one bolt holding it in, but it is a spring, so it'll help to push down against it while the bolt is unthreaded. Then we'll remove the 5 bolts clamping down the manifold pressure switch. With the bolts out, the manifold can be removed with a gentle tug and a bit of a twist. For now, we can just lay the wiring harness out of the way. And now we will start removing all of the valve body bolts. It's best to remove these starting on the outside and working your way in either a spiral or crisscross pattern. This reduces the possibility of warping the valve body. There are several different lengths and 2 different head sizes of bolts holding the valve body in, so it would be a good idea to keep track of what came from where. Then we can lift off the valve body. It's a little bit stuck in place, but a careful bit of prying easily takes care of that. I'm actually going to prop up the rear of the transmission a bit in order to get the sealing surface flat. Hopefully that will help prevent the check balls within the valve body from rolling away. Carefully lifting vertically will get the valve body a bit off the sealing surface and away from the check balls before making sure it's free of the wires and giving it a careful turn to free it of the S-shaped linkage holding the throttle valve to the shift lever. Once that's unhooked, we'll make sure to hold the throttle valve in and we can set down the valve body away from the transmission. We'll also get that throttle valve link out of the way. Take note of where all the check balls are. This 4L60E has 7 check balls on the valve body side. In this case, the gasket stayed completely stuck to the separator plate, which made removing the valve body much easier. With their locations noted and several pictures taken, we can remove those valve body check balls. Some people prefer to use a magnet to pull them out of the case. There is an argument to be made that this isn't ideal because it can magnetize the check balls, which would encourage debris to stick to them. But realistically, I'm sure it's fine either way. And now that everything's out of the way, we can fully remove that case connector. Then we can remove the 2 bolts that hold down the torque converter clutch solenoid. In this transmission, there are 2 solenoids that control the flow of fluid to the torque converter clutch. One solenoid for the valve body and this one which bolts to the case and is fitted into the pump. A little wiggle and it lifts right out. And then we'll fully remove the wiring harness from the transmission. Next, we'll remove these 3 bolts holding in the 1-2 accumulator housing. With the bolts removed, you'll see the separator plate lift up a bit because the spring for the 3-4 accumulator is pressing against the underside. We'll lift up the housing, which dumps out even more fluid. With the housing off, it's a good idea to take a picture or make a note of the orientation of everything inside. This transmission does not have a spring between the 1-2 piston and the separator plate. Then we'll remove these last 3 bolts, which hold the stiffener plate and the separator plate to the case. With the bolts removed, we can lift the stiffener plate off of the separator. This required some gentle prying to separate the gasket from the stiffener. And now we can finally lift the separator plate up off of the case. Once again, the gasket came off in one piece, but often you'll have to be careful to tear as little of the gasket as possible to limit the amount of cleaning that'll be required. Now we can remove that 3-4 accumulator spring that was lifting up the separator plate. We'll try to soak up some of that oil and get enough of it out of the way so that we can see the piston. Now that we can get to it, we can grab the pin and slide it out of the case. This one came out by hand, but sometimes you'll need to use a tool. In order to prevent marring the polished finish of the pin, it would be best to put a small strip of rubber or something similar between the pliers and the pin. Then we'll grab the piston and carefully twist and lift it out of the bore. And then we'll lift out the 8th and final removable check ball in this transmission. While we're here, we can also remove the anchor pin for the 2-4 band. The pin will normally slide out by grabbing it with a magnet. If it seems really stuck, it's possible to leave it there for now and come back to it later when you can push it through from the other side. Then we'll remove the 2 bolts holding in the parking pawl actuator bracket, and the bracket will lift right out of the case. Next, we'll get started on removing the shift shaft from the case. We'll start by removing this black spring clip from the shaft. Simply grab it with pliers and unclip it. If it's really on there, it might help to hold a flat blade screwdriver against the underside to lift while you pull. Then we'll remove the nut securing the shift lever to the shaft. Turn the shaft until the shift lever is pressed against the case, and then you can get the nut turning with your manual impact wrench. Once everything is loose, wiggle the shift lever until it's free of the shaft. With any luck, you can slide the shaft far enough out of the case to remove the nut and the shift lever. If the shaft is resistant to being removed, don't force it. Most likely, the edge will have deformed a bit where it rides against that shift lever. Carefully file away that corner until the shaft will slide out of the case easily. And finally, the shift lever and parking pawl actuator can be removed from the case and separated. And with that, the bottom of the case has been completely disassembled. We'll flip the transmission back over to dump out even more fluid. This next part is optional, but I would highly recommend it. We'll take some scrap 2x4s and fasten a simple fixture that will hold the transmission in an upright position. This makes it much easier to remove and install many of the parts in the case, because otherwise gravity will be working against you and holding things out of center. That makes it much easier to damage bushings and much harder to remove and install some parts. We'll also drill holes so that we can use the extension housing bolts to positively affix the transmission to the fixture. We'll set our creation down on the workbench and carefully lift the transmission up on top of it. Even with a lot of parts removed, it's still quite heavy and needs to be handled with care. We'll thread in 2 extension housing bolts and just get them tight enough so that the transmission doesn't slide around. So now we have a fancy, high-dollar transmission holding fixture. And now that it's held upright, we can get back to taking everything apart. We'll start by removing this O-ring from the input shaft. Then we'll use a flat blade screwdriver to pop off this front seal retainer, and we'll get to work removing the front seal. There are many ways to remove a metal clad seal like this, but this time the easiest way was the destructive one. Basically using a hammer and a sharp chisel to lift the edges up, and then using a flat blade screwdriver or a dull chisel to fold them in. Once it's deformed enough, it can either be removed using pliers or intimidate it to the point where it jumps right out of there. Another way to remove seals like this is to use a tool aptly named a seal puller. A tool like this often won't work if the shaft is still installed, but in this case I think it would also be a good choice. But regardless of the method used, always be careful not to ding the bore the seal is in or the shaft that rides on it. Next we'll remove the 7 bolts holding the oil pump to the case. These special bolts have an O-ring groove cut into the flange on the underside of the head, so it's a good idea to keep track of any O-rings that come loose, even though they will be replaced. The next step is to pull the oil pump. If you don't have a pump puller, this can be a little treacherous. There are some fairly cheap options for pullers out there, or you could always make your own, so it's at least something worth looking into. But on these transmissions, it's usually possible to remove the pump without a puller. There are a few spots where it's okay to put a bit of prying pressure between the case and the pump, but you'll have to choose those spots carefully and be sure not to apply too much pressure in any one spot. Luckily, this pump popped out with very little prying. On the 700R4 I rebuilt for the S10 Blazer, it was definitely not so easy. So if you find your pump is a bit stuck, do have patience. Once the pump is loose, start lifting it up by the stator shaft and just guide it the rest of the way out from the case side if needed. Just be careful not to put that screwdriver blade near any sealing surfaces. And there we go, the transmission pump has been removed. So next, we'll remove the pump to reverse input drum thrust washer. Sometimes it'll stick to the pump, but usually it'll just be sitting on the reverse input drum like it is here. Now, this next part is heavy, so be ready for it. Grab the input shaft and pull the input and reverse input drums straight out of the case. With those set on the workbench, we can separate the 2 drums simply by lifting the reverse input drum off of the input drum. And then we can extract the thrust bearing that had sat between the 2. Beneath that bearing is the shim washer you would change to adjust the main unit end play. This is another part where a magnet would be the easiest solution, but a pick will work just fine. Make sure to keep those together and set them aside. So now we can take a good look at the input and reverse input drums. Clearly, there are many parts inside each of these units. For this episode, we're just disassembling the main components, so don't worry, we'll be taking them apart as well. Back to the transmission, we can grab the 2/4 band and guide it out of the case. If the sun gear didn't come out with the input drum, go ahead and slide it out of the planetary now. With the sun gear removed, we can see the snap ring holding the output shaft to that planetary gear set. It's certainly possible to remove the snap ring with a standard pair of snap ring pliers, and I did for the last transmission I rebuilt. That being said, I would highly recommend getting a pair of horseshoe snap ring pliers. I switch back and forth between 2 slightly different pairs of them in the next few videos. They're similar, but each is slightly more suited to a specific job. But if you're only in the market for one pair, I would highly recommend this Lyle one. They're very budget friendly and a bit skinnier, which helps them reach some of these transmission snap rings a bit better. But no matter which tool you're using, you'll want to carefully spread the ends of the snap ring open just enough to get it over the splines of the output shaft. And with any luck, you can casually remove that ring from the pliers like you knew what you were doing. But 9 times out of 10, they'll shoot off of there and try to hit you in the eye. On some transmissions, as soon as the snap ring is removed, the output shaft will come out. On others, such as this one, the output shaft is staked to the ring gear, so in our case, the output shaft will stay in for now. Then you can grab the outside edge and lift the input carrier assembly and planetary out of the case. And then we can lift out the reaction sun gear shell. There will be a thrust bearing or metal thrust washer inside the sun shell and a plastic thrust bearing beneath it. At this point, you can also lift the rear sun gear out of the rear planetary. The next step is to remove the large snap ring that's hooked into the perimeter of the case. What has worked the best for me is using 2 large flat blade screwdrivers. Start near one of the ends of the snap ring, put one screwdriver between the end of the snap ring and the side of the case. By twisting that screwdriver, the snap ring will start to separate from the lugs on the case. Then you'll basically rinse and repeat this process, attempting to lift the snap ring up over the lugs in the case as you go. It can help to stick a small screwdriver beneath the snap ring to help keep it from clicking back down into the case. Once you've worked your way around the snap ring, it should pop right out of the case and is ready to be removed. In order to remove the next part, the low roller clutch, we're going to separate the transmission from our high-tech fixture. What remains of the transmission is now much easier to move around. The rest of this disassembly will proceed with the transmission flat on the workbench. The low roller clutch will usually end up kinda stuck in the lugs of the case. All we're going to do is tap the end of the output shaft with a rubber mallet and knock it out of the case. And now that it's loose, the low roller clutch can be removed. Most likely, some of the low reverse clutches and plates will come out with it. Next, we'll remove as many of the clutches and steel plates from the case as we can. Do your best to keep these clutches and plates in the same order they came out in. And then slide out the rear ring gear. Since our output shaft was stuck pretty hard to the ring gear, they came out as one unit. Then we can remove the anti-clunk spring from the case. Now that we have the rear ring gear, rear planet, and the output shaft on the bench in front of us, we can remove the rearmost thrust bearing that sits against the back of the case. Then we'll separate the rear planetary from the rear ring gear and remove the planetary to ring gear thrust bearing. Now, as far as these guys, they're pretty stuck together. There are 2 dimples where the ring gear was staked to the output shaft. So to separate the two, we'll just set it up on our fixture and knock it out with the mallet. For this next task, we'll be using a pretty specialized tool. This is a transmission clutch spring remover. There are many different designs of ones that are for sale and ones that you can make yourself. This one was relatively inexpensive and we'll be using it several times during this transmission rebuild. This tool consists of a threaded rod, which I've wrapped with tape to help keep it from scarring up any bushings, this disc with a slot in it that slides over one end of the shaft, and then this claw sort of piece which threads onto the other end of the shaft. We're using this tool to let us remove the snap ring from the low reverse clutch return spring. So, with the tool assembled through the rear of the transmission case, we'll use these 2x4s to space out the disc because of the way I have it set up, and start tightening it down. The claw portion of the tool is inside the case pressing against that return spring. So as the nut is tightened, the spring is compressed. Once it's compressed far enough that it's out of the way of the snap ring that retains it, we can reach in with our snap ring pliers and remove the clip. It's quite a strong clip, which means it really wants to rotate and get off of the snap ring pliers, so it might take a couple tries. But eventually, the snap ring gives in. And then we can loosen up the tool and release pressure on that return spring. It's a good idea to move the whole thing around as it's loosened to make sure the edge of that return spring assembly does not get caught in the snap ring groove. And once the spring is loose, the tool can be disassembled and removed from the case. The return spring still ended up caught in that snap ring groove. Really, the best thing to do would be to put the compressor back in, but giving it a tap does the job too. So, now that the return spring is out of there, we can remove the low reverse piston. This large piston would be difficult to remove by hand, but there's a trick to removing it which makes it pretty easy. Simply fire up the air compressor and apply maybe 30 to 50 psi to this port at the bottom of the case. This port goes directly behind the low reverse piston, so applying air pressure to it will push that piston right out of the case. Then it can be removed by hand. We're getting really close to the end of this section of disassembly, but there are 2 more seals to remove. First is the seal around the oil pump. The models with removable bell housings use this metal-clad seal pressed into the case. A little persuasion from a chisel and it comes out easily. Older models don't have this and simply use a rubber seal around the perimeter of the pump. And then finally, we'll remove the shift shaft seal. This is pretty straightforward, and this seal came right out with a little bit of prying from a screwdriver. And that's it. That's the main section of this disassembly. Of course, there's still a whole lot more to get through, and that will be coming up in the next few episodes. So, stick around, and in no time, we'll get this thing cleaned up and back together. Why do they call it a bell housing? Well,